The morning Cecelia Hargrove rode onto Dusty Creek Ranch, she did not knock. She came through the gate on a bay mare with a silver-trimmed saddle, wearing a traveling coat that cost more than most men in Callow County earned in a year, and she did not slow her horse until she was close enough that the dust from her ride settled across the front porch, where Nora Vance was on her knees scrubbing the boards with a bristle brush and cold lye water. Cecelia looked down at her from the saddle. Nora looked up from the porch. The silence between them lasted exactly as long as it took Cecelia to form her opinion. "You're the Vance girl," Cecelia said. Not a question. Her voice carried the particular softness of someone who has never had to raise it to be heard. "The one who thinks she can run a working cattle ranch." Nora set the brush down across the bucket rim. She did not stand up immediately. She finished the stroke she had been making, wrung the excess water from the brush with both hands, and then rose to her feet and dried her palms on her canvas apron. She was 26 years old. Her boots were cracked at the left toe and resoled twice at the heel. Her hair was pinned back under a worn hat with a sweat ring at the band. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been working since before sunrise. "I don't think it," Nora said. "I do it." Cecelia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that never quite reached the place behind the eyes where real warmth lives. "For now," she said. She turned the mare and rode back through the gate without closing it behind her. Nora walked down the porch steps and closed it herself. That was the first day. It would not be the last time Cecelia Hargrove rode through that gate uninvited. And it would not be the last time she left something open that Nora had to close. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The valley had belonged to ranching families for 3 generations by the time Nora's father, George Vance, ran his first cattle on it in 1871. He came west from Tennessee with $40, a mule, and a wife who could shoot a rifle straighter than most men in the territory. They built the original 2-room cabin with timber cut from the ridge above the creek and spent 11 years scratching a working ranch from ground that gave nothing without being asked twice. George Vance died of fever in the summer of 1882, when Nora was 14. Her mother, Ruth, lasted 3 more years before her heart gave out from the weight of keeping everything together alone. Nora was 17 when she buried her. She did not sell. The banker in town rode out personally to explain that a young woman alone on 240 acres of cattle land was not a practical arrangement. He brought paperwork. Nora offered him coffee and showed him the ledger she had already started keeping in her mother's handwriting, and then her own. Aldridge looked at the numbers, looked at the girl across the kitchen table, folded the paperwork back into his coat, and came back the following spring to extend her line of credit. By the time Cecelia Hargrove arrived in Callow County in the spring of 1888, Nora had been running the ranch alone for 9 years. She carried 63 head of cattle, maintained 6 miles of fence, employed 2 part-time ranch hands during drive season, and had never once been late on a payment. She did not own the finest spread in the valley, but she owned it. That distinction mattered to Nora in ways she did not often try to put into words. The land was paid for with her parents' lives and her own years, with every callus on her hands and every calculation in that ledger, and every morning she got up before light and did what needed doing without anyone there to tell her she had done it well. Cecelia Hargrove's father, Douglas Hargrove, arrived in the valley that same spring with a different kind of money and a different kind of intention. He had made his fortune in railroad contracts and had decided, as men of a certain age and wealth sometimes do, that what he really wanted was land. Not land to work, land to own. He bought the old Pemberton property on the eastern rise, 380 acres of good grass and timber access, for a price that made the other ranchers go quiet when they heard it. He hired a foreman, imported cattle from a breeder in Colorado, and set about building a ranch the way wealthy men build things, with money substituted wherever patience and knowledge would have served better. Cecelia managed his correspondence and considered herself, not incorrectly, to be the one who actually kept the enterprise organized. She was 24, had attended a finishing school in St. Louis, and could speak French well enough to impress people at dinner. She could not read a cattle weight ledger, could not tell a heifer from a steer at 40 paces, and had never spent a night under a roof that was not solidly constructed. She arrived in Callow County with the absolute conviction of someone who has never been seriously wrong about anything yet. The valley's other ranchers received the Hargroves with cautious courtesy, polite enough to keep the peace, watchful enough to protect themselves. Nora received them with the same courtesy and no additional warmth. She had seen money come into a valley before. The first real collision came at the Callow County Stockmen's meeting in May, held as always in the back room of Guthrie's dry goods store. It was a monthly gathering of working ranchers to discuss shared concerns: water access, drive schedules, fence disputes, predator problems. Nora had been attending since she was 19, when old Cal Dempsey had suggested, not unkindly, that a girl her age might be more comfortable waiting outside, and she had sat down in the chair beside him and opened her ledger on the table and stayed. Douglas Hargrove attended the May meeting accompanied by Cecelia, which was unusual. Women came sometimes, but rarely spoke, and almost never in the way Cecelia spoke. She had reviewed her father's property survey and had opinions about the shared water rights along the Eastern Creek tributary. Opinions that were not without logic, but were delivered with the particular confidence of someone who has read about a problem rather than lived beside it for years. Nora listened without speaking until Cecelia suggested, in her mild and carrying voice, that the current informal agreements about water rotation were inefficient and that a more structured schedule would benefit everyone, particularly newer operations still establishing their herds. Newer operations, said Dempsey carefully, haven't gotten through a dry summer yet. The survey data is quite clear about flow rates, Cecelia said. Nora looked up from her ledger. The survey data, she said, was done in April. Come back in August and tell me what the creek looks like, and then we can talk about restructuring the agreements. Cecelia looked at her with those pleasant, assessing eyes. You've been managing alone for a long time, she said. It's understandable that change feels threatening. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone has said something that can be read two different ways, and everyone is deciding which reading to apply. Nora closed her ledger. It doesn't feel threatening, she said. It feels premature. She gathered her things and walked out before the meeting adjourned, which she had never done before in 9 years of attending. On the road back to Dusty Creek, with the evening light lying long across the grass and the first fireflies just starting in the low places by the water, she let herself feel, briefly and privately, the particular anger that comes from being condescended to by someone with less experience and more certainty. Then she put it away. She had cattle to feed in the morning. The summer that followed was dry, as Nora had known it would be. The creek dropped by late July to half its normal flow, and the informal water rotation agreements that Cecelia had called inefficient revealed themselves to be exactly what they were: the accumulated practical wisdom of people who had survived dry summers before. Nora's herd came through without significant loss. She moved cattle to the upper pasture 2 weeks earlier than usual, reading the grass and the sky and the behavior of the cattle themselves, none of which appeared in any survey document. The Hargrove operation struggled more. Their foreman had not accounted for the particular demands of this valley's dry season. They lost 11 head before reorganizing the rotation, and another 4 to a fence failure. Cecelia came to the August Stockmen's meeting and listened more than she spoke, and once, when Dempsey described a grazing strategy that Nora had outlined the previous spring, Cecilia's eyes moved to Nora's face with something that was not yet respect, but was at least its precursor: attention. The situation that brought everything to a head arrived in September, dressed in the practical clothing of a business dispute. The county road that ran along the eastern boundary of Dusty Creek Ranch was the primary access route for 3 other operations, including the Hargrove property. It was a graded dirt road that Nora's father had helped build in 1875, maintained since then by the informal cooperation of the families who used it. That September, Douglas Hargrove's lawyer sent letters to all 3 families informing them that a survey indicated the road crossed a corner of Hargrove land by approximately 40 feet, and that they intended to fence that corner before winter. If the other families wished to continue using the road, they would need to negotiate an easement. Nora read the letter twice at her kitchen table. Without that road, getting her cattle to the county scales for the fall weigh-in would require an 8-mile detour on rough ground. It would also strand the Lester operation and old Widow Carver's sheep place in a similar bind. She rode over to Lester's that afternoon. He was furious. Widow Carver was frightened, which made Nora feel the particular cold clarity that other people's fears sometimes produced in her. The 3 of them talked through their options and decided to go directly to Douglas Hargrove and see whether the man behind the letter was as rigid as it implied. Nora rode to the Hargrove property the following morning. She was shown into the front parlor by a hired girl and waited there for 12 minutes before Cecelia appeared instead of her father. Douglas Hargrove, Cecelia explained with her pleasant efficiency, was in town until Friday. She herself was fully authorized to speak on his behalf. Nora looked at her across the parlor with its imported furniture and its curtains from somewhere that was not Callow County. She thought about old Widow Carver's face when she read the letter. "The road has been there since 1875, Nora said. "Everyone who uses it helped build it or helped maintain it. Your survey finding that the corner overlaps your property by 40 feet may be accurate. It may also be the result of which surveyor your lawyer chose to hire." Cecilia's expression did not change. "My father's property rights are a matter of legal record. Your father has been in this valley for 5 months, Nora said. The road has been here for 13 years. There are other ways to handle a boundary question that don't involve trapping your neighbors before winter. Business arrangements require clarity," Cecelia said. "Informal agreements are not reliable long-term. They've been reliable for 13 years. Cecelia looked at her with those calm, considering eyes. "I understand that you've managed here without much support," she said. "That's genuinely admirable. But the valley is growing, and the way things have always been done isn't always the best way forward." Nora stood up. She had not been offered coffee. She had not taken off her hat. She was aware of both of these things and had filed them where they belonged, in the category of information she would not forget. "Tell your father," Nora said, "that Dusty Creek Ranch will be pursuing its legal options. And tell him that if he wants neighbors in this valley, he should consider what that word actually means." She walked out through the front door and down the porch steps and across the yard to where she had tied her horse. She mounted up and rode home without looking back. Behind her, through the parlor window, Cecelia watched her go. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened next moved faster than Nora had anticipated. The county recorder's office, when she visited it 2 days later, produced not one, but 2 surveys of the road corridor, filed in different years by different surveyors, and reaching different conclusions about where exactly the Hargrove boundary fell. The first survey, filed in 1876 when the land had belonged to the Pemberton family, placed the road entirely outside what was now Hargrove property. The second survey, filed by the Hargrove lawyers' chosen firm in August of that year, placed the corner in question 40 feet inside it. The discrepancy was not subtle. Lester, who had hired a lawyer of his own by this point, confirmed that the 1876 survey had been conducted by a reputable firm out of the county seat and had stood unchallenged for 12 years. The August survey had been conducted by a one-man operation out of a town 2 counties over, that Lester's lawyer described, with careful legal neutrality, as having a history of producing results that aligned with their clients' preferred outcomes. Nora filed the 1876 survey with the county clerk and sent a formal letter to the Hargrove lawyer citing it. She sent a copy to Douglas Hargrove directly. She sent a third copy to the county commissioner's office, which was not strictly necessary but which felt correct. Then she went home and got back to work, because the fall weigh-in was in 3 weeks and she had preparation to do. The response from the Hargrove side came not in the form of another letter, but in the form of Cecelia herself, riding up the Dusty Creek Road on a Tuesday afternoon, while Nora was in the near pasture checking a heifer that had been favoring her left rear leg since the weekend. Cecelia tied her horse at the gate and walked into the pasture in her good boots, which Nora noticed and filed away, and came to stand at the fence rail where Nora was crouched beside the heifer. "She's got a stone bruise," Nora said, without looking up. "It'll heal if she stays off the rocky ground for a week." Cecelia watched her work her hands along the leg. After a moment she said, "My father wants to resolve the road matter." Nora finished her examination, gave the heifer a pat on the flank, and stood. "Resolve it how?" "He's willing to grant a formal easement to all 3 affected properties at no cost, in exchange for the withdrawal of the competing survey documentation from the county record." Nora looked at her. "No." Cecelia blinked. "The easement would provide legal certainty that the 1876 survey is an accurate legal record," Nora said. "It stays in the county record because it belongs there. If your father wants to grant an easement on top of that, he's welcome to. But I won't help him paper over what happened here." There was a pause, a long one. The heifer moved slowly toward the water trough. The late afternoon light came gold across the pasture, and Cecelia Hargrove stood in it with good boots and expensive clothes, and the beginning of an expression that Nora had not seen on her face before. It looked something like the face of someone who has made a calculation and arrived at a result they did not expect. "You know," Cecelia said, "when I first came here, I thought you were simply resistant to change." Nora picked up her kit bag from the fence post. "And now? Now I think you're the most stubborn woman I've ever encountered." Nora considered that. "That might be the most accurate thing you've said to me." She did not smile when she said it. Cecelia did. Just slightly. Just at the corner of her mouth, where she perhaps hadn't planned for it to appear. She rode back down the road the way she had come. The easement was granted to all three families the following week, unconditionally, with no strings attached to the survey record. The Hargrove lawyer's letter conveying the decision was notably shorter than the previous one. Nora filed the easement document with the county clerk and did not make any comment about it to anyone. She was not, by nature, a person who needed to say she had won. The fall weigh-in went well. Her cattle came in heavy and even, and the price was fair, and she rode home from the county scales with a number in her head that would cover the roof repair she had been delaying and still leave a reasonable margin for the winter. She stopped at the top of the ridge above the ranch and looked down at it in the early evening. The cabin with its new shingles on one side and old ones on the other. The barn her father had built and she had repaired 4 times. The fences running straight and true across the grass. The creek catching the last light through the cottonwoods. She had built nothing new here. She had simply kept everything her parents had built alive and working through 9 years of drought and disease and loneliness, and the steady background pressure of people who expected her to eventually give up. That was its own kind of building, she thought. A different kind, but not a lesser one. What she did not expect was the wagon that pulled into the yard 3 days later carrying Douglas Hargrove himself, without his lawyer and without any letter written in advance. Just a large man in a practical coat with the look of someone who has decided to do something direct for once. Nora was splitting wood when he arrived. She set down the maul and waited. He climbed down from the wagon without assistance and crossed the yard and stopped at a respectful distance, and she saw that he was, in person, considerably less formidable than his lawyers had made him seem. He was perhaps 60, thick through the shoulders, with the face of someone who had done real work once, a long time ago, before the money arrived, and made real work optional. "Miss Vance," he said, "I owe you a conversation." She gestured toward the porch. She did not offer him coffee, not yet. They sat in the 2 chairs her mother had put there in 1879, and Douglas Hargrove talked for a while in the way men of his particular background sometimes talk when they have decided to be honest, with some difficulty and considerable relief. He had built his railroad money by being aggressive, he said, by moving fast and asking for more than he expected to get, and accepting a settlement somewhere in the middle. It was a strategy that worked very well in business, and very poorly, he was coming to understand, in a valley where people had to share water and roads and the particular knowledge of a place that took years to accumulate. "Cecelia told me about the heifer," he said. Nora looked at him. "She said you knew what was wrong with it in about 30 seconds, he said, "and that you didn't say a word to her about anything except the heifer until she brought up the road." "It wasn't the time," Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. "She's sharp," he said, about his daughter. There was something in his voice that was not quite apology, and not quite pride, and was perhaps both of them together. "She hasn't had enough people push back on her. She'll be all right," Nora said. She said it plainly, as a statement of fact, because it was one. Cecelia Hargrove was 24 years old, and had lived so far inside the protection of money that she had not yet learned to distinguish between her own judgment and the confidence that money produced. That was a correctable condition. Nora had seen it before. Douglas Hargrove looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than she had anticipated from a man who had arrived in her yard having recently tried to fence off her road. "My foreman says your grazing rotation is the best in the valley," he said, "that you've never lost significant cattle to a dry summer in 9 years. 8, Nora said. "We had a bad year in 83. He wants to know if you'd be willing to consult. On the summer rotation. Paid work, not a favor." Nora looked out at the fence line, at the cattle moving slow and settled in the near pasture, at the creek just visible through the cottonwoods. She thought about what it would mean, about what it would not mean, about the difference between helping a neighbor and being absorbed by one. "Tell your foreman to come by on Thursday morning," she said. "I'll walk the upper pasture with him and show him what I do." That's a conversation, not a contract. We'll see how it goes from there. Douglas Hargrove nodded. He stood up from the chair and reached across and shook her hand, which was not something men in the valley generally did with women, and which Nora noted without making anything of it. And then he climbed back into his wagon and drove out through the gate, pulling it closed behind him. She looked at the closed gate for a moment. Then she went back to splitting wood. The Thursday meeting with the Hargrove foreman, a practical man named Alden who had 20 years of cattle experience, and the useful quality of listening when someone who knew more than him was talking, went well enough that Nora agreed to a second meeting. The second meeting produced a written agreement for a season of consulting work at a rate she considered fair. She was not paid what Douglas Hargrove's railroad lawyers charged. She was paid what the work was worth by the measure she applied to everything, what it would cost the other person not to have it done correctly. Cecelia came with Alden to the second meeting. She brought a notebook and wrote things down in it, which Nora respected more than any particular thing she said. Afterward, walking back to the gate, Cecelia fell into step beside her, at a distance that was slightly closer than professional, and slightly further than personal, a distance that said she was figuring something out. I was wrong about the water rotation proposal, Cecelia said. In May, Nora did not rush to fill the pause. You had data without context, she said. That's a starting point, not a conclusion. I didn't know I was doing that. Most people don't. They reached the gate. Cecilia's horse was tied at the post and Nora's was in the yard. The late afternoon was cooling fast and the first color was starting in the western sky. The heifer, Cecelia said. Is she all right? Nora looked at her. She's fine. Back on the full range since last week. Cecelia nodded. She untied her horse and mounted up, which she did well, Nora thought. Better than the silver-trimmed saddle suggested. Then she said, from the saddle, I told my father you were the most stubborn woman I'd ever met. I know, Nora said. He told me. Something moved across Cecilia's face that might, in another year or two, become the capacity for genuine amusement at herself. What did you say? I said you'd be all right. Cecelia looked at her for a moment. Then she turned her horse toward home. She did not say thank you, which Nora appreciated, because it would have been the wrong register. What she did instead was come back the following Thursday without Alden, with her notebook and a list of questions that were considerably better than the first set had been. Questions that came from observation rather than surveys, from paying attention to what the land was actually doing rather than what the documents said it should do. It did not happen quickly. It happened the way most real things happen in working country. Incrementally, through accumulated small decisions made in the right direction. Cecelia learned to read a pasture by walking it, not by consulting data. She learned the difference between grass that looked healthy and grass that was being overgrazed. She learned why the old water rotation agreements were built the way they were, which was not because the people who made them were sentimental, but because they had survived 3 dry summers and knew what the creek looked like in August. She stopped suggesting that informal agreements were inefficient and started asking why they were structured the way they were. In November, when the first real cold came down from the mountains and the Stockmen's meeting addressed the winter feeding schedule, Cecelia sat beside her father with her notebook and asked one question at the end that showed she had been listening to the right things all fall. Old Dempsey, who did not give out approval easily, said, "That's a good question," which, from Cal Dempsey, was considerable. Nora rode home from the November meeting in the early dark, with the cold pressing down from the mountains and the stars showing hard and bright above the ridge. She thought about the spring, when Cecelia had ridden into her yard with her silver saddle and her fixed opinions, and she thought about the particular kind of change that happens in a person when they decide that being wrong and learning from it is less costly than being wrong and refusing to. She thought about the heifer, fat and settled and back on full range, likely to produce a good calf in the spring. She did not think about winning. That was not, had never been, the point. The point was the ranch still standing, the fences holding, the cattle coming in heavy at the weigh-in, the ledger showing numbers that said, this land is being taken care of, this work is being done, this life is possible and is being lived. In the spring, Cecelia Hargrove rode up the dusty creek road again. She came alone, without her father, without a lawyer's letter. She came on the bay mare without the silver-trimmed saddle, which had apparently been replaced with something more practical over the winter. She closed the gate behind her. Nora was on the porch with her coffee and saw her coming up the road and waited. Cecelia tied her horse at the post and came to the foot of the porch steps and said, "My father's foreman is leaving at the end of the month. He's going back to Kansas." She paused. "I'd like to offer you the position." Nora looked at her over her coffee cup. "I'm not leaving this ranch." "No," Cecelia said. "I know that. I meant a consulting arrangement. Ongoing. A real one, with a fair contract, not a seasonal trial." Nora considered her. What would the terms be? They talked through it there, on the porch, with Nora's cattle visible in the near pasture, and the creek catching the early morning light below. The terms they arrived at were reasonable. A fixed monthly rate, Nora's full authority on any recommendation she gave, no obligation to implement anything she didn't agree with, and a clause that allowed either party to end the arrangement with 30 days' notice. It was, Nora thought, the kind of contract that could only be written between people who had already argued about something important and come through it knowing where the other person actually stood. "One more thing," Cecelia said, when they had shaken hands on it. Her voice had something in it that was not quite discomfort, but was at least the acknowledgement that what she was about to say cost her something. "In May, when I said change must feel threatening to you." She stopped. "I was condescending," she said. "I was doing what I do when I don't know something and don't want to admit it. I was compensating." Nora set her coffee cup down on the porch rail. "I know," she said. "The survey matter." Cecelia nodded. "That too." She put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the pasture for a moment, at the cattle moving slow and content in the spring grass. "You could have handled that differently," she said. "Made it worse for us. Some people would have." "Some people," Nora said, "don't have to live in this valley next to your family for the next 30 years. It was not absolution, and it was not the warmth of a friendship fully formed. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was two people standing in the same place, working from the same facts, deciding what to build from here." The spring was good that year. The creek ran high from good snowpack up in the mountains, and the grass came in early and even across the upper pasture, and Nora's herd went into the grazing season in the best condition she had managed in years. The heifer she had treated in September produced a strong calf in April and stood over it with the satisfied proprietary air of cattle who have come through something difficult and arrived on the other side. Nora put the calf's weight in the ledger and sat at the kitchen table in the evening with the numbers in front of her and felt, not for the first time and not for the last, the particular quiet satisfaction that comes from a thing done right. Not triumphantly, not easily, but right. Her mother had felt it sitting at this same table. Her father had felt it walking the fence line in the evening. It was not happiness exactly, though it contained happiness. It was more like rightness, the sense that the work you are doing is the work you are built for, in the place where you belong, on ground that knows your weight. Outside, the last light was going off the ridge, and the cattle were settling in the near pasture, and the creek was running full in the dark. Dusty Creek Ranch had come through another year intact, which was the only ambition Nora Vance had ever had for it, and the only one that had ever mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.